And we had it in writing in an email. This colonel told him, I'm denying your exemption. If you have concerns about a reaction to this, you should get admitted to a hospital so that if you have an anaphylactic shock or you have a reaction, they can revive you.
Hi, I'm Evelyn Ray. Welcome to another episode of the Caldron Pool Show. Today is a really special episode, and I am so excited to be joined by Davis Younts. He is an American. He has served his country. He's a Christian man, and I'm sure he has got many other things to his name which are incredible, and you are going to hear all about it today. So I'd like to welcome you. Thank you so much for joining me, Davis.
Hey, thank you. It's an honor to speak with you.
Now, I sort of probably didn't go into a lot of detail about who you actually were, your biography, but I would love it if you're comfortable to talk a little bit about who you are, who's Davis, because I think that's really important as we lead into the other subjects for today, so people can understand where you're coming from, why you would have certain information and knowledge about the subjects we're going to cover. So if you'd like to sort of talk about your testimony, how you became a Christian, and perhaps a little bit professionally what your background is as well, that would be much appreciated.
Sure. So as you said, I am a Christian. I was saved by the grace of God and had the opportunity to grow up in a Christian home. And that background, my upbringing really influenced me. My parents homeschooled me all the way through the 10th grade year, my sophomore year of high school here in America. And then what's, again, part of what shaped me in that is my parents weren't just homeschool parents. They were on the front edges of that. As Christians, they became convicted that they needed to keep us at home, and they had to be involved in some of the litigation here where I live now with my family in Pennsylvania to even have the opportunity to do that in a meaningful way. So I know that that influenced and shaped me as a young man growing up. And then after high school, I went to Liberty University. I got a degree in government from Liberty University in Virginia, and then went to law school. I will say that part of how I ended up at law school was just I believe God's calling in my life. In undergraduate, going to a Bible school, a Christian school like I did, I really thought perhaps I was being called into full-time ministry as a pastor, and I was working through that and praying about that. And then something happened that just was impactful for me. As I sat down in a psychology class with my classmates, and one of my classmates asked for prayer. She said, "There's a pastor back home who's dealing with a legal situation, and he cannot find a Christian attorney." And in that moment, I just sort of paused and I looked around that classroom and I said, wow, every other male student in this class happened to be a pastoral studies major. And I was the only one that was pre-law. And then there's this prayer request for a Christian lawyer. And that was the day I needed to go to the registrar's office and change my major or not. So I chose to stay pre-law, and I pursued that. So I went to Dickinson Law School in Pennsylvania after undergrad and was just trying to figure out what my life would be like in the law when 9/11 happened. So 9/11 happened when I was in law school. I graduated from law school in 2002. So with 9/11, I felt a calling, felt it was my turn to go and serve like my grandfathers had, answer the call of my nation to do that. So I joined the United States Air Force and became a JAG in the military. So I served for 11 years on active duty, did everything from prosecution work, defense work. I taught at the Air Force JAG school, taught other JAGs, and then I retired from the reserves. I did 9 years in the reserves. Then I retired as a Lieutenant Colonel JAG from the Air Force in December of 2022.
Wow, so that's fairly recent for you, a big change in your life, only just having resigned in December. I myself went through a resignation where I served over here as well. And I must say it was a really interesting time in my life and it was wrongly so, and I know that it was wrong of me, but it became part of my identity because I had joined and served from such a young age, being 18. I didn't know any different, and I thought once I left, what do I have? Who am I? No one's going to like me anymore. Everybody calls me for advice. Hey, Evelyn, I've had this happen. What would you advise? And a part of it was really sanctifying as well. Did you find a similar experience for yourself when you made the decision to leave? Or was it different circumstances?
No, I think it really was. I think leaving active duty just as sort of a first step was a big deal. That was hard to do. I'd had a good career. Things had gone well for me, and I'd done a lot of jobs that I enjoyed. But yeah, it was a huge change in just letting go of that on the active duty side. From the reserves, to be honest, I sort of left the military in 2021, and we can talk about more why. So I sort of left in my mind the military and really didn't want to have anything more to do with it from that point moving forward. So I served out my final time barely, and made it to 20 years in the reserves and walked away. So I was ready to leave when the time came.
Mm. Yeah, I resigned over here 1 month before COVID hit. And it's interesting. So I resigned in the February of 2020, and March 2020 is when we went into lockdowns and all of this happened. And I often think, wow, I'm so grateful that God in his providence and his
Yes.
grace allowed me to leave at that particular moment, because I was ready then. It was my own decision. I had made the choice for other reasons apart from COVID to leave. And what really broke my heart over here was seeing a lot of police officers be put in a position where they were either forced to leave or they were put between a rock and a hard place and had to make a decision that they wouldn't have normally made because of the mandates that were in place and because of things. And I'm so grateful that God spared me from that, because I looked back and went, wow, one, I wouldn't have taken the vaccine. So I would have been essentially, what we have over here is called a 181D, which is a dishonorable discharge. And
Right.
many police officers who chose not to get the vax over here got a 181D. I have a great friend who served for 35 years, very highly ranked. Him and his wife both got a 181D, which was a dishonorable discharge because they failed to comply with the direct orders from the chain of command to get the vaccine. And I thought, oh my gosh, like to give that much of your life to be dishonorably discharged for something like that. Now in hindsight, with all the information coming out, it just is horrible. So I'm so grateful I was spared from that. And there were also a lot of police who decided to just leave on their own accord, not because they wanted to. They didn't want to be dishonorably discharged. They knew that was going to happen, so they just quit. And I find that the people who did that were the ones that you want serving. They were the ones that you
That's right.
want
Absolutely.
carrying that badge. Now, you have been quite involved in this type of thing within the military in America. And I would love to hear if you've witnessed similar experiences to that happening over there, and the position that serving members were put in during the peak of COVID nonsense.
Yeah, there's a lot to talk about there. I'm sure we
Mm,
could share a lot of stories. And for me, I will say, it was very interesting how God worked in my own life, personally and professionally, to put me in this position. So I was in the reserves going on, getting close to 18 years when COVID happened, just a little over 18 years, and then working through this. And really, I was sort of on my own. Now I was a JAG and I was a lieutenant colonel, so I had some understanding of religious accommodation. I'd worked on
mm,
religious accommodations in my time in the military. So I was working with several friends who were JAGs and others I knew in the military. And we were sort of working on our own packages. We're saying, okay, are they really going to mandate this vaccine? Is it really going to get approval? Are we going to have to submit a religious accommodation? We were working through that. And then there was a dramatic change for me right about the time where it was mandated. I received a phone call. At 11:45 at night from a friend who was an attorney. I'd only met him once. We'd worked together on one case. I'd met him once at a homeschool convention, believe it or not.
mm,
I'd met him there and talked to him there. And he called me and he said, Davis, I have a room full of Navy SEALs. There's more than 30 of them that are being told if they don't get the vaccine tomorrow, they will be
mm.
court-martialed. They will be put in the brig and then dishonorably discharged. What do we do? Right. And
Yeah.
this was in September, right after the mandate came out in America. So September of 2021. So through kind of just a coincidence, really God's providence, I was
Mm,
already going to be with in the same town, in the same location as these men were meeting. So there's a group of pastors, myself and the other attorney that had called me, Bradley Pierce. We got together, we formed a nonprofit called Stand with Warriors, and we sort of developed this game plan focused on how do we bring attention, both political attention, media attention,
mm,
otherwise, to the plight of these Navy SEALs, because we knew certainly there was myself, there were others in the military, but we all felt isolated and alone. But we also knew if Navy SEALs were willing to take this stand, people were going to listen, people were going to pay
mm,
attention, and that was an amazing thing. So that's how I became sort of more publicly involved on a larger scale in fighting and pushing back on that. And because of that, I represented hundreds of military members fighting this, and I spoke with and tried to help thousands as we fought through this. So there's a lot to unpack there. We can talk about these experiences. It was incredibly difficult for so many.
Yeah, I'm not on Instagram anymore, but I once was, and there was a girl that I followed there, a Christian girl. She was only really young, in her early 20s, and her husband was a Navy SEAL. And they had just been rehoused into military housing. So the military provided their home, and she was pregnant with their first child. So they were expecting. And I remember just how devastated she was that her husband was put in a position where he could lose his job, not only because they would lose their income for the family and she was pregnant, they would lose their home because it was military that was housing them. But they were pretty firm and pretty unwavering on the fact that they weren't going to get the vaccine, even though all of these other trials would be presented if they didn't. And I logged off Instagram. It's just too much at the moment with all the social media to have, but I've always been curious what happened. Like, I know that they've had their child, but I've always wondered. And so I am going to get into that with you, because I would love to know if there's been some sort of respite for them on that particular journey. But you mentioned before that you really needed to get political and social attention, that both of those things are important. And I honestly think that having the Navy SEALs, or, the SEALs, those particular people standing against it is the best thing, because they're so loved by the public. I mean, every movie, like war movie, it's always like about the SEALs. Like, it's just
Right.
People think of them as like the Top Guns, like they're the highest of the high. There are other branches, obviously, in military and defense that have a similar clout, but there's a lot of clout around being a Navy SEAL. So I think that it was great that those particular types of men were in a position to publicly speak out, because it could kind of at least get the public attention that it needed. And so my next question was, how many people ended up saying no to these mandates? Because in Australia, I've mentioned before the police, out of the thousands and thousands and thousands, it's very different because we're a lot smaller than America, but out of the thousands of people who were in the police, there were like 200. That's it, that said no.
Right.
Very, very small. It was actually very disappointing for me to watch how everybody just folded. And so was it like that within the military in America? You mentioned that you felt alone at the start. Did it feel, did things change from that? And did it sort of get a bit more momentum?
It did, and honestly, I will credit in large part many of these Navy SEALs when they took a stand and they allowed myself and others to speak out on behalf of them. It really did create a rallying point, and it helped build momentum to let people know. I spent just days and days on the phone talking to military members, giving them resources, just giving my time to do this, and they were like, "I'm the only one in my unit," and sometimes I'd be like, "No, you're not. I actually just spoke to someone
Oh, wow.
who's in your same unit who you just didn't know was there because of the way this, people were not allowed to talk about it within the military. They're told you can't discuss it. They were threatened. So at the height of this, the official number we got from the Department of Defense here in the United States was 264,000. 264,000. So about 13% of the force.
Okay.
So it went from the Department of Defense saying it would be less than 2%, we'll object to this, to at one point it was up to 13%. So that really was a small percentage of people taking a stand, pushing back on this, and that did make a difference. One of the things that happened here was the amount of people that were willing to push back and file a religious accommodation or object to this on legal grounds, and there were legal grounds to do that here in the United States. It slowed the system down. The original plan was to court-martial us all, right? It was court-martial us, put us in confinement, and give us a dishonorable discharge, the same thing the police officers there were threatened with. Because we pushed back the way we did, Congress got involved and they said, you cannot get a dishonorable discharge if you get kicked out over the vaccine. The worst case scenario is a general, which we call under honorable circumstances. So it's not good. It's not a good thing, but it's not as bad. So it took some of the incentive or the threat away, if you will, from the military to be able to enforce this. And that started to make a change as well, because it wasn't going to be criminal. It wasn't going to be charged with a crime anymore. It was administrative actions. And that brought a lot of people, I think, into the fight as well. But what we saw is pockets of resistance. I mean, one of the interesting things that happened through this was I worked with a bunch of what are called Coast Guard rescue swimmers, the rescue divers here. Right. And for our Coast Guard is a very small force. And there's only a few hundred of these Coast Guard rescue swimmers. At one point, about 65 of them out of about 300 were standing against the vaccine. Yeah, wow. And so if the Coast Guard had moved quickly to discharge them, they couldn't have done their mission.
The whole third of them were gone.
A whole third of them were gone. And because of COVID, even prior to COVID, their schoolhouse had been shut down because it wasn't safe. And so there weren't even any students in the pipeline when this was happening. So there weren't even any students in this 2 to 3 year pipeline to do this crazy job. So that was a small pocket of the military, but they stood very, very strong, continue to serve throughout it. And one of the funniest things we had here in the United States is we had a hurricane in Florida. It was devastating. And we had Coast Guard rescue divers doing rescue operations, putting their lives on the line. And our president, President Biden, called to thank one of them and said, "Hey, thank you for what you're doing. What can I do for you?" And he said, "You can help me and my family by not kicking us out." Because at that moment, that same Coast Guard rescue swimmer expected to be discharged. At any moment, he expected notice that it could be gone from the military in less than 30 days. So there were things like that God ordained to happen to get the American public understanding what was happening to our military and getting Congress and our political leaders to push back, which has been really helpful.
Yeah, that's kind of amazing. A whole third of those divers, they couldn't survive without it. They're probably understaffed as is. I understand most government units are very understaffed and you're always run off your feet. So that would have been very scary for the hierarchy of that particular unit, thinking, oh, wow, if 65 of them go, what are we going to do? And then that puts the public in danger as well, because you don't have the resources to help the public out if they require it on the seas and things like that. But I feel like America is quite different legally speaking than Australia, because we over here, we basically tried to put things to the court, the highest court that we have over here, saying that it was a breach of human rights. It was a breach of A, B, C, and D, and it got thrown out. It got absolutely no traction whatsoever. And we had members here as well who tried to go through the medical exemption route as well. But they then started cracking down on doctors and saying that doctors weren't allowed to give exemptions. And then it went so far as if a doctor did have an exemption, and they were willing enough to say, this is a genuine exemption, and I'm going to put my doctor's license on the line for it. What was happening is the police, the military, the fire brigade over here, that hierarchy employed a doctor. And then that doctor would then oversee this person's, this serving officer's private doctor's details. And then they would make the decision, no, that's not good enough. So a GP that has been seeing, so general practitioner doctor who's been seeing a patient for maybe 20 years of their life was overridden by a doctor that's never even seen the particular patient. Did you have medical exemptions for the vaccine over in America? Was it like that over there?
So it was not. It was not recognized medical exemptions. Even in the military, legally, there is a process to do that, but it was treated exactly the same way as what you experienced there. So one client I represented was an Air Force major. He was a physicist, an engineer, one of the most brilliant minds that our military has. And I don't say that lightly. He taught at West Point. He did amazing things. This brilliant man. He was going through this. He had concerns based on his religious faith, but he also had medical concerns. So the first medical concern he had is the FDA and the CDC here, our organization said, don't take this vaccine. It's contraindicated if you have had an allergic reaction to certain antibiotics. My client had that allergic reaction to those antibiotics. So he's like, okay, he went to see an allergist and a general practitioner and military providers, provided that information. Then his brother went and got the vaccine. And his brother ended up being hospitalized because his brother had an allergic reaction to it. Mm. Then, I kid you not, his sister she went to a local pharmacy here, went to it, received the vaccine, collapsed in the parking lot, went unconscious in the parking lot, and had to be given emergency aid after she took it. So you have an officer with a rare skill set who the military here has invested, millions of dollars in training, is doing all this really important testing for our future. He's already had a contraindication in his own because of his own allergies. His brother and sister, who, biologically, DNA, they're the closest people in the world to him. So we filed a medical exemption. A lower ranking military doctor reviews it and says, I'm going to have to deny it because policy says I have to deny it. But if I were you, this is what he told him, if I were you, I wouldn't get this vaccine. So he submitted it. It goes up. It goes to a colonel, and we had it in writing in an email. This colonel told him, I'm denying your exemption. If you have concerns about a reaction to this, you should get admitted to a hospital so that if you have an anaphylactic shock or you have a reaction, they can revive you. I'm not kidding. So there were all kinds of issues. I mean, story after story. Absolutely. Military doctors that granted these exemptions had their medical licenses threatened. There were allergists in cities near military bases who were reviewing these cases, reviewing these allergies and granting them for military members. And the military started investigations into these civilian providers. One in Texas, they even accused of fraud, as if he was doing this fraudulently. So, what was frustrating for me within the military system is the military would not recognize medical exemptions, even though their own policy that existed prior to COVID was if you had previously suffered from a virus, you didn't have to take a vaccine for it in our military. That was a standard exception. That's one of them that was listed. For COVID, they said, no, we're not going to recognize that. Even as studies were showing natural immunity was much more effective than these vaccines, so-called vaccines. They were ignoring that. So that was a huge issue here as well. Yeah,
it's the same narrative, isn't it? All across the globe, different scales, different trajectories, perhaps, but it's all the same. What happened to the American military and emergency services happened over here in Australia. And I'm sure it happened in the UK. I'm sure it happened in Europe. I'm sure it happened everywhere except for third world countries. Who would have thought they would have got it better than we did with all our systems and rights in place? We failed probably the worst out of all the countries in the world. The more oppressive countries gave their citizens more individual freedom and rights. Like, who would have thought, hey, what a time to be alive.
Right.
But it's so back on to I just wanted to clarify something with the Coast Guards, that particular group. You mentioned that they were out serving. So all these mandates were in place, but they were still out serving and doing things. Over here in Australia, we had, if you didn't take it by a certain date, you were gone. Even if there was you basically lost your job and your income and then had to pursue things legally after the fact. You weren't allowed to currently serve. I also have a case over here where a police officer went into the station past that date and went, I'm still employed. Like, I haven't taken the vaccine. It's at court now whether they have a right to force me to. So why should I, until due processes happen, why should I have to lose my job and my income? The boss of that police station actually physically violently removed this police officer from the police station and then tried to charge him with trespassing. And I remember just being totally shocked by this. So when you mentioned that they were still able to serve, that piqued my interest because I thought, is that the case? Was it in America that if you put an exemption in or you put grounds on religious reasons why you didn't want to take it, or perhaps there was a lawsuit that was going through the court system at the time, what did those members have to do? Were they still able to work and serve and get paid, or was it sort of what happened over here to us?
So that's part of the hypocrisy of all of it here, right? So the justification for this for our military was this is absolutely necessary. And even just the religious piece of this, the religious accommodation process that we have here for our military members, that was just ignored. And the argument was military necessity. The challenge was, and the hypocrisy was, there were many in the military who were allowed to continue serving throughout this whole time. Unvaccinated, they continue to serve. Others were not, and
Right.
that was used as a punishment. So you have to understand our military is huge when we talk about the numbers of people that we're talking about. But with the Coast Guard rescue swimmers, the Coast Guard moved slower than the other forces because they're small and because they were concerned. They saw what was happening. They saw what happened when the Navy moved out first. The other service sort of waited in the background. They saw what happened, and the Coast Guard realized they just couldn't do the job if they enforced it in that way. So that was part of the hypocrisy. So you would have situations where military members from one unit were continuing to serve, doing everything regardless of their vaccination status, and then others at a different location were seen as such a threat that they couldn't even leave the installation. They couldn't go to church at times during this process, because of where they were stationed, and not because the status in the local community was higher or lower. It was very, very arbitrary. So, it was different. The Navy SEALs that I'm talking about, the initial group that objected and many others, they were not allowed to do their job. They were not allowed to do their job until recently. So they were Navy SEALs, fully trained, fully deployable. They had deployed during COVID. Most of them had COVID. Many of them had it while they were deployed, still did the job and came back and, were stateside, but they were not allowed to do anything, but they were prevented from being fired because of an injunction in federal court. And so a federal court in our system stopped them from being kicked out, but they were still being punished every day. They were made to do things that were very demeaning, sort of the lowest level for a military member, and they couldn't do their job. They couldn't deploy. So they were completely sidelined. And so that happened to a lot of military members. There were about 13,000 military members that were kicked out with an adverse service characterization. So their discharge paperwork says misconduct, that they disobeyed an order and engaged in misconduct. And so there are about 13,000 that weren't protected by the courts that are still waiting relief. And we can talk about some of the things we're doing to help them, but that's part of it. But there were thousands more, and I don't know how many more. It's very hard to track, but probably 100,000 more that simply left. They retired if they could retire. They didn't re-enlist. They resigned. They found a way to get out for medical reasons or otherwise, and simply left our military. So that was a huge hit to all of our services as well.
Absolutely. And I don't think we are fully going to comprehend the consequences of losing that much personnel, trained personnel, the amount of money that the government will have to put forward to train new personnel. I think that we're yet to see the negative consequences for all of these actions that were taken over, those few years. Now, I just wanted to talk about reasons to not get the vaccine legally. So we've mentioned exemptions and things like that, and religious medical grounds to not take it. Are you able to go into the main sort of reasons that you can legally object to taking the vaccine over in America?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's sort of two pieces to it that we fought through in the military and held true for most of the rest of society. First of all, and a lot of people didn't realize this, when the vaccine was mandated, there was not what we would call an FDA approved vaccine that was ever produced in the United States or made available to the public. And people look at me like I'm crazy when I say this. But what happened is this: the pharmaceutical companies, Pfizer and Moderna, they created an emergency use product. So we call it in the United States an emergency use product, which means it's not fully FDA approved, but it can be used. Now, what happened is the military mandated that, right? They said, hey, the FDA has approved a formula of this vaccine, and they mandated it, but the companies never produced it. They had millions of the EUA products, so they sort of tried to do a bait and switch with the United States military. So we objected on that grounds. We said, look, there's not an FDA-approved product available for the military. And there's a statute, a federal law in the United States prevents experimenting or forcing military members to take an experimental product or an emergency use authorization product, because we have a history of doing that in the United States, unfortunately.
Mm.
So we objected on that grounds, and we won cases within the military system on that grounds, administratively for military members. But that was one objection here. So that's sort of unique to the United States. But what happened as well is the American people didn't know that they were receiving a product that was emergency use and was not FDA approved. Most of the American public did not understand that. And many waited to receive this vaccine until after FDA approval, thinking that somehow would guarantee their safety in it, without realizing that what they were being given was a different formula. So that was one issue here. The other issue within the United States that all people have to raise based on our constitutional system is a religious accommodation. So whether you're working with a private employer, a state employer, the federal government, or even within the military, our law recognizes religious accommodations. So we have a legal test that's in place that says, hey, government cannot infringe upon a sincerely held religious belief without a compelling governmental interest and without demonstrating that there's no alternative. There's no least restrictive way to accomplish this same goal, whatever that interest is. So that is baked into our constitutional system, as well as our Supreme Court has addressed that. So that was a huge issue for the military, because even within our military, we recognize military members don't give up their constitutional rights when they join and serve. So that's kind of the big framework legally we were dealing with.
Mm. And speaking of the religious reasons why you wouldn't want to get the vaccine, I've heard people mention, reasons because of how the vaccine is created, is derived, and how it's from fetal cell lines. Was that the major religious reason that you were seeing over there?
I would say that was the main concern. I think for most, that was easily understood and just violated their conscience, and they understood that. I will say, particularly with these Navy SEALs, there was also a religious objection that was just based on the authority of government to infringe upon human rights in that way and to mandate this. And it goes into the idea of what authority, what God-given authority does government have, and what happens when government goes too far. So there was certainly a religious basis for many of these Navy SEALs to say, yes, fetal cell tissue is a big issue for us, but it's also this idea that the government is going beyond their authority, their God-given authority, and mandating this. So many of these Navy SEALs just felt an obligation to fight this because it was a just cause to fight it, even if it meant, personal career compromise for them. Even for some of them, they thought when they defied this, they were going to go to prison. I mean, they expected to be court-martialed when they first said no. So they were willing to fight that on the grounds that this is outside of the God-given authority of our government to mandate something like this on society as a whole. So that was a huge issue as well. So for many of my clients, it was both, but certainly the fetal cell issue was huge here.
I think I've heard somewhere in previous interviews that you've done that was a major issue for yourself. Is that obviously, like you left the military, and did it come down to all of these mandates and things? Was that the sort of straw that broke the camel's back for you?
It was. I will say the other issue was just everything that happened with the withdrawal from Afghanistan was very, very difficult as well. So it was like these two things coming together, and these significant leadership issues and just moral issues that were arising. But for me, I mean, this is how God works. So for me personally, I was a reservist, and so I was required to do essentially 2 weeks a year, and some other time as well, to earn a good year for my reserve retirement. So the mandate came down, and then when the mandate came down, I was just a couple months shy of 19 years. So I submitted a religious accommodation request. That was denied. I submitted an appeal to that because there was an appeal process. I submitted an appeal. That I received notice that my appeal was denied on the 3rd of July. Okay, 3rd of July, 6 months, right before the 4th of July holiday, right? But symbolic there, right? But it was also just 6 months from when I could retire, just under 6 months from when I could retire. And so I fully expected to be kicked out of the military without a retirement, with adverse paperwork. When I received that, I was given 5 days to comply. I refused. What happened for me, and this was God, is an injunction was filed in federal court in Ohio to protect military members here in the United States. The judge signed off on that injunction to prevent people from being kicked out of the military on a Wednesday night. I expected to receive a reprimand and my notice I was being separated that Thursday or Friday. So that injunction likely saved me by a matter of 24 or 48 hours. 6 months from when I could earn a retirement. So the injunction helped me, that prevented me from being kicked out, but I retired absolutely as soon as I could. 20 years in one day. I was done. I had no desire to continue to serve in our military under these circumstances. And I felt like I could continue to do more outside of the military, and quite frankly, have more freedom to be critical when I needed to, and felt it was important to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I wanted to get into that about sort of what you're doing now, because from my understanding, the mandates for the military and defense personnel in America, it's still ongoing. Has it been fully resolved? And whereabouts is all of this currently at in terms of the legal system and in terms of serving and current serving members?
So it's sort of a mess still. So what you have is sort of two things going on at once. One is our Congress has said the military, they control military funding. So they said, hey, we're not giving you funding for the next year if you continue to mandate the vaccine. So our Congress forced the military to end the mandate. The problem is that there's still ongoing federal litigation about the religious accommodation process and how rights were violated during that. And you have all of these people who were kicked out. So over 13,000 were kicked out with an adverse service characterization. They lost everything. They don't even have their full veterans rights or benefits or access to those things. They've lost those things. But then you have thousands and thousands of military members, again, probably 100,000 military members that had their career absolutely destroyed by what happened. So for example, I represented a colonel she was a commander, and she was fired from her command position because she wouldn't take it or enforce it on others. And so she went from being a colonel, probably going to be a general officer at the height of her career, into a career that was ended. And that's at the highest level. At the lowest level, you have people who were not able to promote, who were not able to move to a new position, not able to take command or remove from command or leadership positions for 2 to 3 years, depending on where they were at. That was a big problem. And pilots are another example. So some pilots were allowed to continue flying at other bases. I have clients that weren't allowed to fly for 18 months or 2 years. They lost all of their currency. They lost all of their ability to continue to fly. And so they had to do a lot of training and other things to even continue to serve. So very, very difficult for those military members. So the real fight that's in front of us right now over the vaccine mandate is, can we preserve the religious accommodation process? Can we preserve that process and ensure it's done correctly in the future by continuing to push these cases in federal courts and other cases related to religious accommodations, as well as how do we fix the careers of these people that were damaged? And then there's also a very long process to try to restore those that were kicked out wrongly. Their religious accommodation was denied or a medical exemption was denied, and they're suffering the consequences of that. So can we make them whole? So that's those are the next fights. And all of that here in the United States is in an environment of increasing and growing hostility within our military towards Christians, just Christians as a whole, and traditional Christian values. So that's also going to be where this fight is going to continue to be very, very difficult.
It seems like a lot of fights are ending in that particular place, doesn't it? At the moment, every angle, everything is it's seems like it's an all-out war on Christianity. And usually the institutions, the organizations and places where Christianity thrives and makes something better, they're trying to get rid of it. And it's quite scary thinking about what the end result of that is going to be. And I do want to get into that, but I would love to hear what the success rate has been so far for these matters that you're talking about in court. Are the courts doing their job basically, or are they failing the people?
So, it's a mix in certain things. So we were able, personally, I was involved in some cases where we were able to achieve success for military members who were able to continue to serve even through the military's own administrative processes. What we have seen here is federal courts that are at least willing to look at and litigate the issue of the religious accommodation and the religious freedom piece of this. The courts have not been willing to look at the medical piece and give it any real scrutiny. They haven't been willing to look at the other things. There's sort of the dogma, right? The dogma is vaccines are always good medicine with no exceptions, no matter what. If we call it a vaccine, everyone should get it. Our courts are not sympathetic to those sort of arguments at all. They won't look at the science. They won't understand it. But the religious freedom issue is one where we have seen success, and those cases will still be going through our courts for a time. But there is a favorable landscape for those cases in many of our federal courts. So there is definitely continued hope there. And right now, our Supreme Court has a slim majority that seems to be interested in really protecting religious freedom for all Americans. And so this is a good time for these cases to move through our court process.
Isn't it? I find it so remarkable that the science is settled on these things, that courts don't want to hear it or weigh it or measure it. You know, it's interesting because it's probably the most anti-science statement to ever make, that the science is settled. Anyone who knows anything is that it's constantly changing. It's constantly you're getting new knowledge, new information that you have to weigh and measure. You have to use logic and reason to come to rational conclusions about things. But they're so irrational in their desire to just not want to even look at the changing science. It's settled, and it's remarkable. It's infiltrated our legal system, the place that should be the most objective place that isn't infiltrated by society and the mob. But in Australia, we see it here all the time. Our court systems, our magistrates, our judges, it's infiltrated the systems so much so that it's not impartial anymore. It's not objective. They're the pillars that built those things. That's why our nations prospered, because we had these places that offered that for people. I'm glad at least the religious, that was surprising that they're willing to accept that. But then again, America was founded more so, I think, than Australia on the pillars of religion and freedom, and I guess acknowledging that God was above the government, and the government, that's the men who made America. The Puritans went over there and they did a good job. I will say that they did a lot better than what we did on the prison island over here. That's for sure. But I wanted to get into, I guess what is there anything that we, like, I know I'm in Australia, but is there anything that American people can do over there to help with the ongoing efforts in the unfair dismissals, the people who left because they didn't want to be, like, what can people be actively doing, something tangible that they can do to help with the efforts that you're making with these members of the military?
Yeah, honestly, it's really on two fronts. It is on the legal front, but also the political front. So one of the things people get frustrated with is it feels like the political system is slow, and it feels like our political leaders don't always listen. But the reality is, when the Navy SEALs stood up, our Congress acted, and they made it so that it would be very difficult for the military to court-martial people. That was like a small first step. And the pressure continued, and they said, okay, we're not going to fund the military if the military keeps this mandate in place. So that was the next step. The final piece in this will be getting our Congress to reinstate these military members, to fix their discharges and do that. So we need to be working that political piece as well as the legal piece. So on the political side, the American people should know, when you call a congressman or you call one of our senators, they write down that phone call, they track it in their staffs, and they assume for every one person that calls, they assume there's 1,000 people with that opinion. That's the political insider in our capital and how people think. So when you call, it's not just one phone call or email. They really do track those things, and that pressure is real. So we kind of get exhausted with the political system. But I would say it's not just about voting, but it is about contacting your representatives, contacting these political leaders and keeping the pressure up so they don't forget about it. And then on the legal front, we need to be praying for our military members. We need to be looking at organizations that are helping. When this started, we had a nonprofit called Stand With Warriors, started by pastors to help. We're going to be moving forward with sort of a new version of Stand With Warriors in the future that's going to help not just deal with military members as they fight this, but actually train Christians within the military to lead well and to be prepared for these fights so we're not caught on our back foot or flat-footed when the next one comes. So those are the things to be doing. But honestly, I really do think a lot of this has to do with our gospel work, because where we weren't prepared for this in large part, I would say in America, was our churches. So many of our churches were not prepared, had not thought through the theology of what is government's authority, what's the church's authority, what's the family's authority. They hadn't thought through those spheres of authority. And so we were in a situation where far too many of our churches, and I think a lot of it has to do with their theology, were simply not engaging in the public sphere at all, sort of believing in a heresy of two kingdoms where, we're going to do our church thing over here, but we're not going to get involved in culture because that's messy and we don't need to touch that. And that's been very, very dangerous. And so again, many churches were not prepared to help military members or even just average citizens fighting this. Many were not. And that was a huge problem here.
Yeah, definitely. We had the same thing over here. Our church has failed us more than anyone else. And I think they failed us more than anyone else because it's a time when the church needs to thrive when things like this happen. You go there for your spiritual food and water, and it left us starving and dehydrated outside on our own. It was quite shocking. I wasn't even allowed to go to my own church because I chose to not get vaccinated. These are reformed churches over here as well. Like it was incredibly difficult. It still is today. I still feel like a refugee, to be honest, over here. But yeah, I love that that there is an acknowledgement that the churches need to really do better in future, because the likelihood is this will happen again. Especially like if you look at a history book, the government take far easier than they ever give back. And the precedent has now been set for us, and we'd probably have to be either ignorant, willfully, or stupid to think that this won't happen again. So I think I love that we need to start preparing churches for if this does happen again, and preparing men who can be great leaders during this particular time. It is encouraging though, because I have seen, and I don't know if you've seen as well, there's been like a new era of shepherds, of great men of God who are stepping forward. I think a lot of Christianity has become academic. And it was once something that God called men to do on their, because there was a need. Nature hates a void, and, Christ can fill those things. And I think that's what we're seeing now, that there is definitely a void, and there are men who are stepping into it, not just pursuing things because of academics. And so it's encouraging to see these sorts of men come out from the ashes, so to speak, from these experiences. But if you're comfortable with it, you mentioned something before about Afghanistan, and that being part of the reason why in your mind you were like, in my good conscience, I don't think I can, do this. And part of the reasoning why I left the police as well over here was personal reasons. My personal life changed, but not only that, in good conscience, I didn't really want to be part of the organization anymore. There was a lot of ethical and moral dilemmas that I would have been faced with that I just wasn't comfortable doing anymore. So Afghanistan sounds similar to you as being one of those things. For those of us across the pond who are watching, we're going, what's happening here? Like one day the American troops are in Afghanistan, the next day they're gone, the next day the Taliban's back in, and we're like, what is this? Like you got to turn the TV and you're like, is this a skit? Is this satire? Is this real? Like, is this how this is going to be approached? So this is obviously a very complex subject, very complex, but are you able to explain for you what Afghanistan was and how that was handled?
Yeah, and I mean it's difficult personally and professionally to walk through it, right? And like I said, I was in law school when 9/11 happened. I was in my JAG training. So at our JAG schoolhouse doing my training as a JAG, watching the statue of Saddam Hussein topple, right, in Baghdad, right? So I'm in training in literally in an auditorium watching it on CNN as it's happening, and then moving forward, I deployed in support of our efforts in Afghanistan. So my entire military career was involved in fighting this effort in Iraq and Afghanistan. And so there was a lot about the way we left Afghanistan that was deeply, deeply troubling to me. The first was just the issues of apparent and obvious military lack of leadership, lack of moral courage. What do I mean by that? Here's the indication. As the American forces are pulling out of Afghanistan, first of all, it was a deadline that was set for political reasons. There was an arbitrary date. You don't fight wars on a calendar. You don't fight wars on an arbitrary date. Whenever you give an arbitrary date to end something, it just means it's arbitrary. So it's political. It's not because of what's happening there. That's not the reason for it. It's some other reason. So that was the first thing, this arbitrary deadline. But then as the American forces are withdrawing, you have some units and some commanders that are destroying all of their equipment, blowing up ammunition dumps, destroying their equipment, rendering it unserviceable. You have other units right next to them that are not. They're leaving it all to the Taliban, to ISIS, to whoever wants to come and get it, with no control over it. Why is that so significant to me? That was extremely significant to me because that meant the senior leaders in the military were not giving clear orders to the commanders on the ground. They were literally saying, leave. This is when we're going to leave. And if a commander on the ground says what you and I know they would do, which is, okay, I need direction. I need to know what to do with our equipment, what to do with our personnel, what to do with our translators. What's the guidance? And the guidance was, this is when we're leaving. Withdraw your forces. And so commanders had to make decisions on the ground, not knowing what it would be. So that level of just lack of leadership and lack of courage for senior leaders to actually give direction to the military members on the ground carrying out these tasks that was shocking to me as in uniform during that, and again, God's timing is interesting. When that happened, when we actually withdrew, I was on orders. It was the last time I wore a uniform, the last time I actually was physically on orders serving. And that's when it happened. And it was just shocking to all of us. So that lack of leadership was difficult. Big picture, we started to get into my Christian faith and my theology. All of a sudden it changed how I perceived what we were doing there in Afghanistan. And arguably there's differences with Iraq, but part of it for me was, okay, as a Christian, I joined, I served, I supported this, I deployed in support of that effort because I believed it was just war. I believed it was consistent with my faith, my theology, my understanding of just war. And if the answer is, well, we're going to leave now. We went in because the Taliban was evil, because the Taliban was harboring terrorists, because of human rights violations, all of these things that could be argued as a just cause for a just war. And they just disappeared all of a sudden because of a date on the calendar. Very, very difficult for me to reconcile that as a Christian as we look at this. And I'm not saying, I think you could make arguments about whether Iraq and Afghanistan should be treated the same or analyzed the same under just war theory. And certainly make arguments about whether or not being in Afghanistan was a just cause, whether it was just war. But the way we withdrew just sort of makes it very, very difficult then to do that analysis if we're going to be honest about it.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about your opinion on the difference between Iraq and Afghanistan, because 9/11 was not. It was an American thing, but it hit the entire Western world. We had soldiers in Australia deploy after 9/11 because we're allies. You had British and UK soldiers deploy. It hit the entire world. So we all had invested interests in it. I remember I was actually in high school at the time. And I remember I was sitting in one of my classrooms and there was only 6 of us in there. It was an elective that I don't even remember what it was, waste of time, but not many of us really were interested. And I remember our teacher turning on the TV. And I think my parents must have shielded it from me or something, because I went to school not having a clue about what was happening in the world. And they put the TV on, and I remember watching the footage as a teenage girl, just being shocked. It was the first time in my sheltered little life that I had seen something like that happen. And so I have that memory as a child experiencing that. And, it hit all of us. And so, but it's interesting, the more time that goes on past 9/11, and the more you look at the war in the Middle East, the more, particularly for me as a Christian, I'm questioning whether it was just, and at what point should have things changed. And I think as well, the more that I learn about the corruption inside government, and the more that I learn about how the people who are making the decisions are very godless, it makes me really question my views on the entire thing, from even Iraq, from even the get-go. So what are your sort of theological and personal views on all of this? And was there a time for you in particular that it changed, or was it just the Afghanistan thing that kind of confirmed that for you?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I will say, when I joined the military, I was sort of a true believer in what we were doing. I thought there were weapons of mass destruction. I thought there was a clear threat to the American people in Iraq. So for me personally, I had a clear conscience in what I was doing, what I was supporting, and the why behind it. Looking back, I now have grave concerns that, perhaps what was motivating the war in Iraq was more, defense contractors than anything else. Maybe there was a level of deception there. So, I have concerns about Iraq. I think most of the people that served, most of the people that went into it, that volunteered to serve, that did the job there, were doing it for the right reasons. I believe they can look back on that time with clear consciences, because their government asked them to do something. Their government gave them the information, whatever that information was, whether it was reliable or not. That's what we moved forward on. So I think there is a difference between the individual and the nation as it comes to that. Whether or not there was corruption at the highest level, whether or not it was intentional deceit, if there was, that would make it not a just war. But for the individual military members in Iraq in particular, we could argue about just war overall and whether that really was tied to 9/11, but certainly the people that were serving for the right reasons. And I believe that. And I think we can look back on that with a clear conscience. With Afghanistan, again, slightly different analysis, because we say, okay, there seemed to be a clearer tie to Osama bin Laden, to the actual terrorists involved in what was happening. And arguably, there's very little economic benefit, other than, again, for defense contractors, if we're going to be honest, to being in Afghanistan, right? Afghanistan has no real significant natural resources that were there to be exploited or otherwise. So it looks different, but it's the similar question. Why were we really there? What we were really doing? It did make sense. And I think you could still argue it was just, but then again, if it was just, did we really finish what we were there to do? And when should we have left? And how we should leave? Because part of, theologically, part of just war theory is how we end war. Even Augustine talked about that, right? How we end war. It's not just why we fight a war. It's not just how we conduct ourselves in war. It's how we end it. And that should be just as well. And I do think we missed that. So it does create a very difficult challenge for Christians. I believe America was founded as a Christian nation. It's not that our founders were perfect, but listen, historical documents tell us the book that was quoted the most, other than Montesquieu, right? The book that was quoted the most by our founding fathers as they were founding this nation wasn't even the Bible as a whole. It was the book of Deuteronomy. I just think about that for a moment. Think about how powerful that is. You mentioned it earlier, right? There's a God above the law. So we were founded as a Christian nation. So for people to serve in the military throughout our history, there's always been this idea that we're going to go back to our founding principles, that we're going to, swear an oath to a constitution that's based on biblical principles, biblical ideas of law, biblical ideas of government, spheres of authority. Even our separation of powers are based on this idea that all men are sinners, right? We're all sinners, and we have to protect ourselves and balance out our sin with our branches of government. So all of that is to say, these raise difficult questions, because now we have to ask the question, are we still a Christian nation, right? Are we behaving like a Christian nation? Are churches influencing policy? Are we seeing the common grace of God's law and God's blessing on our nation? And right now in America, it feels like we're going through a very challenging time in that regard. And we have, for the first time, a president, and I won't say for the first time, but the first time so visibly, right? You have a president who is, displaying an LGBTQ rainbow flag on the White House, right? Like promoting that over anything else, and so we're seeing a level of sin and depravity in the United States that's so publicly visible. It's not that it always hasn't been there, but it's so publicly visible and celebrated. It feels upside down. And that's certainly now a part of our military and a part of what we see happening in the military. So again, if you're being asked to serve in a military when your nation is embracing things the Bible teaches are sin and wrong and lead to destruction, how are we just in what we're doing then? It gets much harder to think of military service as supporting a just war if our nation's turning their back on that.
Oh, absolutely. You raised some incredible points there that are definitely conversations that we need to have. They're definitely things we need to consider. They're things that we haven't perhaps considered as much as we should in the past. But like you said, it's so blatant now, the depravity that we are seeing on display from our leaders. I think it was John Calvin who said, when God wants to judge a nation, he'll give them bad leaders. We're seeing that in all spheres of the authority. We're seeing the church leaders failing. We're seeing our civil government failing. We're seeing fatherlessness and the head of homes failing. And you've got to, there's only so much we can turn our back on God before, and how many times we can mock him before judgment comes. We saw this with the Israelites. Like the Exodus happened. He delivered them, and they made golden calves and complained that they weren't getting enough food, even though he rained down manna on them. And so I feel we're in this tug of war. It's from the beginning of time where, we turn our back on God for a period of time, and then bad things happen. And then we go, oh, this godless thing is perhaps not a good idea anymore. And I unfortunately think we're reaping the fruits of a very godless system right now. And it's interesting, you mentioned that when the Constitution, when the founders of America were doing that, they read Deuteronomy. I am fully Rushdoony pilled, and I have gone through all the, I've got it here. See the blue book? That's Rushdoony.
I've got it right behind me on the shelf as well.
I can see it. It's the same book. So, once you get Rushdoony pilled, I'm like, man, I love the law. Like, what the heck? Why don't people? But it's interesting because it's been almost hijacked. If you love the law, people go, oh, that's legalism. Well, no, it's not. Right. It's as a result, it's this inevitable result of discipled nations. You can't help but want to obey. And I think it's Psalm 19 and then Psalm 119 is all about loving the law. And it's funny, you read Psalm 19 and you go through, it talks about how the law is like sweeter than honey. It's better than all. And I'm like, wow, you ask any Joe Blow on the street or at the pub what they think of the law. And it's not, can you think of anyone who talks about the law as being as sweet as honey and as precious as jewels? And I'm like, we should go back to that. And no, that's not me saying I agree with legalism by any means for salvation. But I think that, I really think that it is increasingly becoming harder to be a Christian in 2023. In the world that we have today, it is so hard being a Christian because we are so hated by everything and pushed out. And it's like you mentioned before about Biden, how he's had the pride flag, the trans flag. There was this horrible video going around with this trans person topless with fake breasts, just like shaking them on. And I was like, can you imagine, like, let's say, because right now aliens is like the biggest thing going around. Just to preface, I do not believe in aliens, but hypothetically, let's say they're aliens and they're just like looking down on earth. There's no way they're going to invade people. Like they would go, they offer us nothing. There is no intelligent life form here on earth. Why would I bother? But it was truly shocking. But I think we're in a transition from desensitizing to normalizing. So the way that you,
Right.
if you look at history, you desensitize people to ideas so that it can become normal. And I think we've been desensitized for such a long time that it's becoming so bold and so blatant and so in your face that we're at that peak transition now where they're trying to just make it so normal that if you don't see it as normal, you're a bigot or you're a phobia of
Right.
some kind.
That's
That's
right.
sort of my little take on all of that. But wokeism is the only pandemic I would be happy to mandate out of existence. That's for sure. Are you seeing it like in America, in the military, like has wokeism just run rampant? Because you see these horrible pictures out there with men in dresses and like high up in the military, these trans people. And you think, is that just like a one-off, or is it increasingly becoming more woke within the ranks of the military?
It is becoming increasingly more woke, and one of the things that's happening in the American military is just sort of mediocrity and just facilitating and moving through the bureaucracy well has created a system of senior leaders. Many of our senior leaders haven't seen combat, right? They've never been in combat, and it's one thing for a JAG like me. I never saw combat. I deployed, but I didn't see combat. But I'm also not, trying to become the chief of our joint staff or the head of our army, leading our military men into this. So that's part of it. The other issue with our military is it's just become very political, and the way that politics are influencing things, it's become dangerous in our military. What's happening now, the huge fight we're having now, is our military, the same military that said, if you don't get this vaccine, even if you've had COVID and you're at no risk, right? You've survived COVID. You're not going to get COVID again, or you're unlikely to get it again. You're at low risk, like a young Navy SEAL. We're not going to keep you around. We're not going to use you because of military readiness. At the same time, that same military will pay $500,000 to $1 million for a service member to go through hormone therapy and transgender surgery. And that individual during that entire process will not be able to deploy, will not be medically fit, and they probably never will be again. And it's the same military that pays for military members to travel out of state to get an abortion if they need to go to a state that has put restrictions in place for on abortion. So when you talk about wokeism in our military, those are just two examples of it, but it's gotten to the point, I say it slightly differently than you did. I see it as tolerate, celebrate, participate. That's the sin. That's the sin pattern we see here. First, it's just tolerate it. It doesn't affect you. It's just them over there doing it. Just tolerate it. Just let it go. Then it's celebrate. Well, look, we have to recognize these people for who they are, and they're sad if we don't, so we need to celebrate them. And then the expectation is you'll participate in it. So real world for military members today, right now, wokeism is to the point where if you're a commander, you're sitting at your desk, at some point a package is going to come to you where you're going to be asked to sign an approval to allow the military to pay someone to travel to go have an abortion or for transgender surgery. And you're going to have to sit there and decide as a commander, are you going to sign off on that order or not? Are you going to approve of that or not? Are you going to allow that or not? So that's the level of wokeism we're seeing. At the same time, I was just dealing with it. I don't know if you saw it in the news. We're just dealing it with this week. I had a client that shared with me a military chapel, the United States military, Herbert Field and Air Force Base. The military chapel was promoting the creation of a Norse pagan worship group and recruiting a Wiccan faith leader for the installation. And I'm looking at it, I'm going, it really is Christ or chaos. Like, are we really like, we're showing open hostility to the Christian faith in the military, and then we're going to go so far as to embrace these ancient pagan religions that have no respect for women or for family or for the sanctity of life or any of those things. And if any of these people weren't so deceived and so lost in just spiritual depravity, would they even recognize how dangerous that is? And why would our military promote that? I mean, we fought for freedoms against things like that in the history of the church. It's just, so there's a lot of battles to be fought there.
Absolutely. We have the same thing over here. I think it's our fire brigade over here. We've have our epaulets, like that give you your rank and things like that. You can actually order in now as part of the uniform epaulets that are rainbow. On the shoulder, I'm thinking, how much money is this costing our taxpayer dollars to do something like this? And then not only that, there is this like expectation that if your entire crew, your shift is wearing them and you're the only one who's not, it's like, oh, why is Bob over there not wearing his? Is he a homophobe? Is he a bigot? And so there's this culture that's breeding with wokeism, and it's like if you don't participate in it, and you just do all these things and you just ignore it, like then you're accused of being hateful, and it's almost pushing people out of these organizations, which is really sad. Like I said earlier in the episode, at a time when the world is chaos, we need godly leaders. We need good men and women who are willing to stand up for God, to pick up the cross and follow him. We need people who are willing to take the narrow path. And they're the sorts of people who desperately need to be influencing these, the military and these defense forces, but they're getting pushed out. So my next question to you would be, as a Christian, is it safe to sign up for the military or for the police? Because in good conscience, can you? And if you don't, are you then assisting in the destruction of these? Does it need to fall down? And from the ashes, do we need to come back? These are some conversations that need to be had. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on that and the Christian conscience because good people want to serve, right? You got two types of people who want to serve. Ones that genuinely want to do good and join out of that desire and motivation. And then you get people who like the badge, who like the clout, who like that, right? They're the two sorts of people. It seems to be pushing out the ones that you want in there. So back to my question, sorry. How as Christians do we navigate this? And especially Christians who have that inherited desire to serve, to protect, and to defend. How do they move forward?
It's a very, very difficult thing. Like I said, both my grandfathers served in the World War II era. One served in World War II, the other was a merchant marine and then served during the Korean War. And so, you have military families like mine that look at this and think, well, would we want our children to serve? Would we encourage that? And today I always ask, I frankly discourage most Christian young people from serving today. And when they come, should I serve? I always ask why. What is motivating you to serve? Are you going into it, for the right reasons? Or is it something else? So I always ask that question. So I think you can be a Christian and continue to serve. I think we need Christians in the military and the police and our FBI and our other places. However, I think what we have to view it differently than we did in the past. I think that now we have to be prepared. We have to be prepared in our hearts, our minds. We have to be we have to be wise in how we approach it, because it's not a question of if, but when we will have to take a stand for our faith in those environments. And what happens when you do that, you have to go into it counting the cost. You have to going into it saying, okay, I'm going to go and serve in the military now, but there will come a point when my faith may dictate that my military career is over, and I have to be willing to accept that. I cannot make my military service, who I am in uniform, an idol that is more important than my faith. We learned that through COVID. Some were called to continue to serve. Some were called to take a stand. Some survived and won great victories. Others did not, but yet they were all serving God and how they were doing that. So that's my call. I want people to continue to serve. That's really part of my heart moving forward. I see Stand With Warriors moving into that vein where we can help disciple leaders within the military, within our FBI, within our federal police forces, and help them be prepared to make the right kinds of decisions and to take a stand when those moments come, because they are coming, they will continue to come. But when enough of us say no, it has an impact. It can make a difference, and it can stop, the tyranny or whatever it looks like. Even during our American Revolution, they say historically only 3% of the people in the colonies in the United States actively participated in the American Revolution, only 3%, but that was enough to achieve a victory in that. So, throughout history, you can see very, very small groups of people Christians in particular, taking stands that God can use to make an incredible difference. So there is an encouragement in that. So can you serve in the military as a Christian? You can, and some of us will be called to do that, but it's going to be very difficult, and you have to do it, I believe, with the mindset of you're going to have to say no at some point. Take a stand and be prepared to face those consequences.
Very wise words. Very wise. And I think 100%, people are going to have different purposes, and people are going to have different positions where they can do certain things. But I was guilty, I believe, of idolatry in my badge. And God really kind of hit me over the head with a stick of humility with that when I made the decision to leave. But that was the battle that I had, because I had to make that choice. And in the end, I did make it. But there was a point where I needed to make the choice whether I am in obedience to God, and He's my master. He's the one who owns me. I serve Him, or whether it is the badge. And it was difficult, because of my sinful nature. But my goodness, have I been rewarded tenfold for that decision. It's not, and I'm not preaching a prosperity gospel here by any means. Life has had its challenges post badge, but I can honestly say this part of my life has been the happiest I've ever been in my entire adult life. And that's, I believe, living as obedient as I can. And I will always fall short, but for sure, there will come a time where people are faced with these tough decisions. And I think if we're building up our churches, and we're building up men, and we're building up leaders within these things that can assist people during those hard decisions, good can come from that. And so I love that that's what you're doing. I would love to send people to, you mentioned the Warriors organization that you're part of. Mm-hmm. Where can people follow that? Where can people follow you? And how can people keep up to date with what's happening with the military and all of these court cases going on?
Yeah, so my website is just my last name, younts.law.com. It's Davis Younts, Younts, on Twitter and Instagram. So I try to post and encourage people with information through those things. Stand with Warriors right now, we're in the process of reorganizing and relaunching. So we're going to launch in October officially for Stand with Warriors. So that's on pause right now while we get organized kind of for the next phase. It's going to really focus on leadership development as well as evangelism within the military. So we're excited about that. But for now, follow us through my website, and we will also be making announcements about Stand with Warriors through that as well.
Amazing. Well, October, when it comes along, do send it my way. I would love to give it a bit of a plug and share it. I'm sure people who watch this episode will be curious as well. So make sure you do send all of that through once it's there. But I really want to just thank you so much for today. It's been really great. I feel like I could talk to you even longer, but I'm aware of the time. I've probably stolen too much of it already. But it's been a real eye-opener and a real encouragement as well. And I'm grateful that there are people like yourself who are able to use the gifts and skill and experience God's given you for His glory, for His kingdom. And yeah, I look forward to seeing what happens post-October when all of these things get launched.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for what you're doing and just the encouragement you are to so many. Keep it up. God bless you.